Happy Friday, everybody. This is a more intimate gathering than usual. I think one of the reasons is that I wasn't scheduled to speak about Russia or Ukraine, so I think that's all anybody really wants to talk about. But
It is.
it is what?
I don't, your microphone.
I think it is. Can everybody hear
Now
me?
it is.
Yes. The microphone, I might be on, but anyway, very, very good to be with you again. The world doesn't get much simpler, it gets more complicated, and I call it geopolitical entropy. But for the scientists in the room, you're not hearing me well? All right, let's see. It should be on. Is this better? Okay. I'll try to speak closer to the microphone, but I'm hearing some feedback. In any event, like I said, when we came up with a curriculum in November, I thought it'd be very interesting to talk about what's going on in Israel, because this is a very unique period in Israeli political history. I mean, I can talk, I had a comment this morning at breakfast about really understanding the basics of Israeli parliamentary system, to talk about the history of Israeli governments. We could talk about Prime Minister Bennett. For Canadians in the room, Prime Minister Bennett was born in New Brunswick. He went to Dalhousie for law school. He then moved to Calgary, and he actually sat in the Northwest Territories legislature for a while. He served as Minister of Justice and Foreign Minister under Prime Minister Arthur Lyon, and then he became Leader of the Opposition and then Prime Minister from 1930 to 1935. Retired to England, was the only Canadian Prime Minister ever elevated to the House of Lords, a peerage, and that was Prime Minister Robert Bennett. He died in 1947. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is the Prime Minister of Israel right now, and sort of tongue-in-cheek for those of you who actually remember the 11th Prime Minister of Canada. Bennett is the 13th Prime Minister of Israel, and his faction, the Amina faction, which means to the right, has 7 seats, but only 6 seats that actually support it. That's 6 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. So you have minority governments and you have majority governments. For those of you who are only American and have very little exposure to British history or Israeli history or Canadian history, Israel has a parliamentary system of government. The Knesset is a unicameral legislature, meaning there's only one house. You don't have a House of Representatives and a Senate, or a House of Representatives and the House of Lords, as you do in England. 120 members of the Knesset, which is based on the number of the Great Assembly, Knesset HaGdolah, which had 120 members. These are the Jews who returned to Zion in the 5th century before the Common Era to construct the Second Temple. People often confuse that with the Sanhedrin, which was after the time of the destruction of the First Temple, that had 71 members. So you have 120 members in the Knesset, and essentially Amina has 5% of the voting power of the Knesset, and yet their leader is Prime Minister. I cannot think of another time where the leader of a party that didn't have the most votes was Prime Minister. I mean, Netanyahu did serve as Prime Minister in 2009. He had one fewer vote than Tzipi Livni, so that was marginal, but Ehud Barak immediately gave him his support, so they had an overwhelming majority. This is an aberration that I'm not familiar with any similar example in modern Western democracy, but it seems to be working. It's one of the most unusual coalitions that you can think of. If you go back in Israel's history, there's no election ever where one party got more than 60 seats, meaning an absolute majority of votes. But you had a left-wing bloc or a right-wing bloc. There have always been coalition governments. If you want a real quick history on Israeli parliament, so Ben-Gurion was famously the first Prime Minister of Israel. And from 1948, actually February 49 was the first election, all the way through 1977. So for almost 29 consecutive years, the left-wing Mapai, Labor Party as it's called now, ran the country. And sometimes you had Mapai with Rafi and Mapam, and sometimes they brought the religious factions in. they never really needed them. They were never really hostage to the religious parties. That started later, and I'll tell you when. But through 1977, you really had a dominant, secular, left-wing political orientation in Israel. The big transition took place when Menachem Begin won the 1977 election. This wasn't the first election after the Yom Kippur War. In 1974, Yitzhak Rabin was elected for the first time as a member of the Labor Party. But the Yom Kippur War basically planted the seeds that enabled this transformation to take place. And think about it. Think about one-party dominance for such a long period of time. If you go since 1977, the left really only sat in government for 8 years. In 1984, Shimon Peres entered into a rotational partnership with Yitzhak Shamir, so from 84 to 86, and Shamir was prime minister, sorry. Peres pulled what was called, for those of you who speak Hebrew, the dirty trick on Shamir in 1990, but it backfired. He tried to do a deal with Shas, and the other religious parties did not come on board. He promised them, the sun and the moon and the skies in terms of dollars for their religious institutions and yeshivot, and it backfired. And since then, the religious parties really had a disproportionate role in Israeli coalitions up until this current coalition. They're out of this government for the first time in 7 years, and they were out of the government also from 2013 to 2015. But the right wing has really been dominant in Israeli politics since 1977. Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister from 92 to 95 when he was assassinated. Shimon Peres stayed on for a little less than a year, from November to May, half a year essentially. Bibi won. His first term in office was 96 to 99. Barak was prime minister for less than 2 years. He was prime minister from June essentially of 1999 until February of 2001. And then Sharon, who replaced Bibi as the head of the Likud, was prime minister. He left the Likud, but didn't leave the prime minister's office. When he formed Kadima in 2005 in connection with the disengagement from Gaza, he was a sitting prime minister of Israel, overwhelmingly popular in Israel. Certainly my lifetime, and Guri and I overlapped for a little bit, but since I've been politically sentient, there's never been a prime minister in Israel who was as popular as Arik Sharon up until the time he had his stroke at the beginning of 2006. Ehud Olmert was elected prime minister, but on Sharon's coattails. Sharon was projected to win about 43 seats, and Olmert got 34. So that was the difference and it was only a month and a half after the stroke. So that momentum, who knows if Olmert would have even won if it were just him. The Likud was decimated. They got just 12 seats in that election. But if you think about the Likud, they have only had 4 leaders in their history, which is remarkable. This is going back to 1948. That's 73, almost 74 years ago. 4 leaders. You had Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, then Bibi Netanyahu, then Arik Sharon, and now Bibi Netanyahu. And for all the noise that we've been hearing about the indictments and case 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, Bibi Netanyahu is still the leader of the Likud. And they've only had 4, and it doesn't look like they're going to have a new one anytime soon. But we've talked about Bibi a lot over the past few years. This class is not about him. If you have questions, obviously I'll be happy to answer them. So the pattern of politics was pretty much, we had the left, and you had the right. Sometimes you have coalitions of the left in the center, the right in the center. Very rarely you have left-right coalitions. Right? And sometimes it would be sort of center-left and center-right. Even when Shamir and Peres got together in 1984, and they had the first of their, what they called national unity governments, or in 1967, when they had the ominous threat of the Egyptian armies and the closure of the Straits of Tiran and the evacuation of the UN forces from the Sinai, Likud and Labor, Menachem Begin and Levi Eshkol, had a brief national unity government, but these were the 2 pillars of the center, right? There were many parties to the left of Labor, and there were some parties to the right of Likud, but these were mainstream parties of left center, right center getting together. Now what we have is completely aberration. You know, so Bezalel Smotrich is sort of a Kahanist. I'm not saying that derogatorily, but Yamina is definitely a right-wing party. New Hope, Gidon Sa'ar is definitely a right-wing party. If you look at the political issues that have punctuated or defined where you are on the spectrum in Israel, a lot of it has to do with national security, 2 states or 1 state, peace with the Palestinians, territorial concessions, and the left historically was perceived as being more conciliatory, and the Oslo Accords and peace with Jordan. Counterintuitively, but if you think about it, it's much easier for a right-wing government to negotiate peace, as Begin did in 1979 with Egypt, and for the left to prosecute a military conflict because you're expecting to get less criticism from your political rivals because that tends to be their own inclination anyway. But here you have 8 parties in a coalition, which is the largest ever. Putting Kadima, which is kind of quirky, aside, the first time that a member of any sort of non-Labour or Likud party is running the country, if this rotation agreement makes it through and Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid gets to be prime minister, you'll have 2 new prime ministers, or 2 prime ministers who come from completely new parties. Not Robert Bennett, R.P. Bennett, but Naftali Bennett he never sat in the government as a member of the Likud. He was Netanyahu's chief of staff when Netanyahu was not in government. When Netanyahu was in the Knesset, but as the leader of the opposition during Omer's premiership, and then he contested the leadership of what was then called Mafdal, and the Kippah Sruga, the religious Zionist party, and he won that in 2012, and he entered the Knesset with 12 seats in 2013. Yair Lapid was never in politics. His father, Tommy Lapid, was a journalist, a very popular television personality, and he started a party called Shinui in the late 90s that came into the Knesset with 17 seats, was the number 3 faction in that Knesset, and then didn't even stand for re-election in the following Knesset. It was a very brief flirtation politically, and then he passed away. And his son came into the Knesset about 15 years later with 19 seats. Yair Lapid got 19 seats the first time he ever ran. He became finance minister in 2013. Very leery of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who did very poorly in 2006, but did well enough, again, 1 vote away from Tzipi Livni, formed a coalition with Barak, and that is what essentially made Kadima, which eventually also disappeared from the Israeli political map, into more of a left-wing party, because Barak outflanked Tzipi Livni and Kadima so much so that he actually had to leave his own party and form his own split faction called Hatzmaut, the Independence Party, and he served the balance of that Knesset, not as leader of the party that he brought into the coalition, but as an independent, with about half of his faction. So there's been a lot of dicing and splicing and splitting among Israeli parties for many years. If you try to appreciate how we got here, how do we get to a situation where essentially a party with 6 seats, with 5% of the Knesset, can have its leader serve as prime minister? And to me, it's amazing. Because if you go back to the elections of September of 2019, actually it started in April of 2019. April of 2019, there was an election. It was pretty clear that Bibi was going to be able to form a coalition. And Lieberman said, no, I'm not joining this coalition unless you come back to the Orthodox communities and force them to participate in their social community burden, so to speak, serve in the army, pay taxes, do all the things that he was critical that they weren't doing enough of. And the religious faction wouldn't budge, he wouldn't budge, so they had to go to re-elections. And Bennett and Shaked and their party didn't even get into the Knesset. So here's a guy who a year and a half ago didn't even get elected to the Knesset, who is now serving as prime minister. And the reason for that is Bibi Netanyahu, because he was so reviled by pretty much anybody who wasn't within his inner circle, which was the Likud and the religious parties, and that's it. If you look at the current constellation of parties that make up the Israeli government, you have two that are clearly to the right, Yamina and New Hope. Gideon Sa'ar is true blue Likud. He does not favor a two-state solution. He's now the justice minister. He's extremely nationalistic in terms of his own political predilections. Those are two clear right-wing parties. If you look at, on the other side, you've got Meretz, which is, they're the pillar on the left, and Labor. When Barak was prime minister and then when he was defense minister, I would say that that's as close to the center. If you go back historically, Ben Gurion wouldn't recognize his own party today. Maybe Yitzhak Rabin wouldn't either. But even the concessions that the right of center are talking about making today are beyond what Rabin envisaged, or at least what he spoke about before he was assassinated. So you've got Yamina New Hope to the right. Am I right? Or you're right. You have Labor and Meretz to the left. You have two parties that are, I would say, clearly centrist. Yesh Atid and Kachol Lavan. Blue and white is Benny Gantz's party. They famously formed a coalition, and we take you back through all the 4 elections that Israel had. And then you've got one that amazingly isn't being talked about anymore as clearly to the right, and that's Avigdor Lieberman. Lieberman actually left 2 Israeli governments because he thought that Bibi Netanyahu, who he was his chief of staff for when he was first elected in 1996, was being too conciliatory, too far to the left. Now Lieberman is considered to be mainstream centrist. For me, that's amazing. Same as Sharon. Sharon was the author of the disengagement from Gaza, which people criticized because it turned into a Hamastan base for terror against Israel. But he was also, half a generation earlier, known as the butcher of Sabra and Shatila. He was definitely considered to be among the most right-wing reactionary politicians on the Israeli scene. So he changed. Lieberman, I don't think, has changed as much, but he's not as clearly to the right as he would have been perceived 5-10 years ago. And then you have the United Arab List, Roth, with Mansour Abbas. And that's pretty incredible. So you did have different coalitions. There were even times when there were Arab parties that were sort of participating, but an Israeli government has never in history been dependent on the support and the votes of an Arab party. And they are now. And Mansour Abbas is not just part of an Arab party, he leads the Arab party that is most closely affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. These are not Zionists. So if you look at the 8 again, you've got Yamina, you've got New Hope, Lieberman, Yisrael Beitenu, then you've got Yesh Atid Kachol Lavan, you've got Labor and Meretz, and the UAL, the United Arab List. To me, it's mind-blowing. It's amazing that they've lasted this long. But, again, to talk about representation, I can't think of another place that is so broadly represented. President Biden just announced Ketanji Brown Jackson to be his nominee to fill Justice Breyer's seat on the Supreme Court. The criteria he was criticized for this were that it has to be an African-American woman. People said, well, why? And he said, well, because we want the court to look like, the rest of us. And, in parentheses, a conservative judicial watch group recently supported Justice Brown Jackson, or Judge Brown Jackson's candidacy, saying that she's certainly as qualified as anybody else for this kind of job. And if you look at her credentials, I think that's understandable. But the look and feel of today's Knesset is more representative of the tapestry and diversity of the Israeli population, political opinions, than any other Knesset I can think of. Extreme right, extreme left, centrist, Arab, all sitting together. And Bibi is the glue. if Bibi Netanyahu either disappeared, resigned, was replaced, this coalition I don't think would last very long, because the Liebermans, the Saars, the Bennett's, their natural home is in the national camp. Their natural home is on the political right. They would much rather choreograph their political agenda with fellow travelers who are left in the Likud than with Mansour Abbas or Nitzan Horowitz or Michal Michaeli, the leaders of the UAL, Meretz and Labor respectively. They don't feel like they can get many of the things done that they really want to do, like build out the settlements, build in Area C. Instead, they're issuing unprecedented numbers of visas to the Palestinians. They're not negotiating with the Palestinians, but the symbol, certainly since President Biden has participated. I mean, President Biden was elected president. Prime Minister Netanyahu is still the prime minister. But one of the things that this government has done is, without tipping its hand too much, because it can't, is being more conciliatory to the Palestinians than its predecessor government was. But it really can't do very much. And in my opinion, that's not a terrible thing, because it's not going on any sort of political adventures. Instead, it's running the country. And I think the consensus, and there's no consensus in Israel, I think the sense in Israel, for the most part, is that it's running the country pretty well. You know, Bibi famously had campaign posters with him on one side shaking Trump's hand and him on the other side shaking Putin's hand, and it would say, Netanyahu, Liga Acheret, I'm in a league of my own. And it was a credible campaign, because to his credit, Prime Minister Netanyahu had forged very strong relationships with leaders around the world, not just Putin and not just Trump, but in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, whether China, India, and that's a big deal. And I think that it helped elevate Israel's role on the global stage in a way that for most people in this room is mind-boggling. I mean, we don't think of Israel as being a major power. It's not yet a major power, but it does wield disproportionate influence. A lot of it is driven by some unbelievable technological advancements. Much of it is driven by the perceived and real threat from Iran. And Bibi was good at cultivating relationships with a few key countries. And he was also, as Israel's longest-serving prime minister, up until Trump got elected, always having to deal with an American president that he didn't really get along with. Bill Clinton, his first term, and then he and Obama were elected within weeks of each other. And for the first 8 years of Bibi's 12 and a half consecutive years in office, he didn't have a friendly face in the White House for the most part. And we can save this for another lecture as to who's more or less responsible. Right now, the relationship between Israel and Washington is strong. It's being tested by the current conflict. And because people who are not in the empty chairs are at home watching what's going on in Ukraine and how this whole contest is unfolding, let me give you my thoughts on the conflict, and because this class is devoted to Israel, what this means for the Middle East. So this was something, I said this in the first class, and I certainly repeated this in the last class, this is not good for Israel. No country really has an interest, well, most countries, most Western democracies don't have an interest in seeing one sovereign nation invade the territory of another sovereign nation. But for Israel in particular, this is really bad, especially because the United States is so visible in its leadership role as being trying to defend Ukraine and to criticize and thwart Russia. Israel is in a thankless position because obviously in its heart and soul and minds, it wants to side with the country that's being invaded. Israel has spent all of its history defending its own borders, trying to prevent precisely this type of incursion, invasion, aggression. And it would be the most natural voice on the planet to say, this is untenable, this is unconscionable, and we are with the West in making this stop. Unfortunately, Israel has a neighbor to the north, Syria, that is essentially controlled by Russia and has has Iranian, the Islamic Republican Guard is very present in Syria. And if you want 2 seconds of history, I'm not pointing fingers at Obama, but when Bashar Assad crossed the red line in 2013 and launched chemical weapons against his own people, and this was a red line set by President Obama. That is a red line that would not allow Assad to cross. Remember, the Arab Spring started in 2011. For a while, he looked very vulnerable, but Russia didn't allow the West to do too much against Bashar Assad, and they helped a little bit. They really wanted to protect their port, Latakia, which is their only port in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's actually their only port on the Mediterranean. So, and their air base in Tartus, both of which are in Western Syria, on the Mediterranean. So once Assad crossed that red line, it was pretty clear the United States would have to act. And John Kerry, who was Secretary of State at the time, promised a reaction that would be extremely small. Okay? He said, West, we will react with an extremely small reaction. The same John Kerry, I don't know if you guys can follow his career, but he is now President Tsar for climate change. And when Putin invaded Ukraine, I'm not making this up, he said, I hope that President Putin is keeping in mind what this incursion might mean for climate change. Someone asked me how we can say that with a straight face. You know what the answer is? Botox. So, anyway, putting Secretary Kerry aside, that was the reaction of the Obama administration. So one thing led to another, and essentially the United States, with a modest contingent of a few thousand soldiers, left a vacuum there. And it was filled by Iranians and Russians. Russia came in and essentially established a very strong military presence in Syria. And the Iranians started, filling gaps with arsenal and arming Hezbollah in Lebanon and arming Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria. And the Israelis started knocking a lot of these things out, killing a lot of bad guys, and certainly eliminating a lot of their weapons. Not all of them. I mean, nobody can get them all. I don't know whether we got a quarter, a half, 2/3, but the only reason Israel is able to fly what I believe are thousands of missions over the past 8 or 9 years in Syria is because Israel is completely coordinated with the Russians. And so the moral question for Israel now is, what do you do? Do you sort of try to play both sides, or do you take this as an opportunity to demonstrate where you stand? And Christiane Amanpour, who is a well-known journalist, who was on CNN for many years, was appalled. How could Israel, who's supported consistently by the United States and the United Nations, that vetoes all these sanctions, best friend, qualitative military aid, all of which is true. By the way, all of which is true. So, first of all, Israel doesn't have a formal role in this conflict, but as is often the case in international disagreements, people are going to look to point a finger at. And that's certainly happening now. Where is Israel? Or where should Israel be? Why is Israel being looked at with any greater scrutiny than Canada or Mexico or Brazil? Because she's Israel. And because people feel like that Israel owes the United States and owes the West a unequivocal clarion voice of support for what the West is doing in standing up to Russia, and a condemnation of Russia. And when the UN Security Council issued condemnation against Russia, Israel wasn't on board. Why? Because Israel's not a member of the UN Security Council. Now, it's true that the United States did try to garner additional countries to sign a letter appended to this condemnation, and got 80 signatories. Israel is not one of them. but Foreign Minister Lapid said that when there is a General Assembly, which Israel is a member, condemnation it will be on board. So we'll see what happens next week, but I expect Israel to join its name to that. The UN Security Council member who abstained, and is one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, is China. So depending on whether you watch CNN or Fox News, on CNN, this is a sign that the bromance between Putin and Xi Jinping is not as deep. And when they announced at the Beijing Olympics a month ago that this is a relationship that knows no limits, I guess there are limits. And we can see that limit being expressed in the abstention of the United Nations. If you're watching Fox News, it's like, whoa, so where's China? China's supporting Putin. China's letting all this stuff happen. China doesn't even have the temerity to join the rest of the free world in condemning Putin. Well, it's because China is not part of the free world. And I'm always amused when, I do read the Israeli press, well, Bennett volunteered to mediate between the two countries, and Bennett reached out to the presidents of both countries. Look, to me that's funny. I think it's great that he reached out, and if I were prime minister for a day and I got to make 2 phone calls, maybe those would be the 2 I choose. But, and Israel is a democracy, and Russia and China is not. But the real power broker in the world right now, as far as this conflict is concerned, is China. The force that can enable a reduction of hostilities is not the United States, it's not France, although Macron is certainly the most active, trying to insinuate himself into a de-escalation, which is a positive thing. Once Xi Jinping decides how he wants to play his hand, then I think things are going to get a lot clearer. So as we talked about last week, watch that space. And I specifically said how he wants to play that hand. Because if you look at look, the Iranians came up with chess, but most of the grandmasters, certainly in our lifetime, have been Russians. So we think that Putin is a great chess player. He sees 11, 12 moves ahead. He's never lost a war. He has never lost a war. He didn't lose a war in Chechnya. He didn't lose his war in Georgia. He didn't lose his war in Crimea. And this one hasn't played itself out yet. But I don't see this as a chess game. I see him playing poker. He's playing poker, and he's doubling down, and he's looking at his cards, and nobody else can see him. And sometimes he's trying to show, the edge of a card. This is my nuclear card. It's in my hand. I've got it in the deck. And how do you respond to that, right? How are you going to bet against a guy who's got a nuclear card in his hand? So you go back to the Batman movies, right, about the crazy Joker. You have no idea how he's going to behave. And that's maybe, I certainly can't get into Putin's head, but maybe that's one of the things he's trying to do. They fired I don't know what it was, but they fired something very minuscule at a Ukrainian nuclear reactor, and it caught fire yesterday. But I don't know. Certainly it wasn't an accident. If they wanted to take down the reactor, they could, but they didn't. And whatever they did was strategically brilliant, because it was a signal that we can do whatever we want. We can knock this thing out and be 10 times worse than Chernobyl. And they already have Chernobyl. And for those of you who remember what happened in 1986, when you had the nuclear meltdown, which I actually think was the single greatest catalyst that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. More on that if you want in a second. But they could just puncture the sarcophagus in which all this radiation is being held. They could radiate the whole country if they chose to do that. I mean, already Russia's holding a lot of cards. And this 40-mile convoy is not really a convoy. It's a bunch of smaller convoys that got bottled up there because the Ukrainians blew up some bridges and impeded the access to Kiev. And they're kind of sitting ducks. So the question's asked, why don't the Ukrainians have an army? They have a strong army. Their army is probably among the top 20, 25 armies in the world. And they have Stingers, and they have Javelins, they have anti-tank missiles. The Germans, Olaf Scholz, who replaced Angela Merkel as Chancellor, has been sending arms to Ukraine. It's the first time Germany has exported arms since before the Second World War. 1,000 anti-tank missiles, 500 surface-to-air missiles. But Russia controls the airspace. So even if Ukraine has planes, Ukraine has several planes, but if a plane goes up, the plane gets shot down. So that's really, when you see how this plays out and you get a really good feeling watching President Zelensky on TV and you're inspired by his moments of Churchillian patriotism, this is not a fair fight. And when country after country in NATO, France, Germany, the United States, say over and over again that they're not going to bring troops into Ukraine, it's a sad day for Ukraine. Ukraine is asking Israel for Iron Dome. I don't know, I think it'd be an interesting test. Israel will not send its Iron Dome to Ukraine. But if it did, so far the Iron Dome has proven itself to be extremely effective against Hamas rockets. Those are, homemade rockets. I wonder how effective it would be against Russian missiles. And if it were effective against Russian missiles, that would be an incredible thing in anticipation of what we may see from Hezbollah and ultimately Iran. Iran is the big winner here, by the way. It's hard to say. So Israel doesn't gain very much from this. I just want to finish on Israel and get to Iran in a second. Israel is not going to be the mediator. If I'm wrong about that, I'll be very happy. It'll be wonderful for Israel. It'll elevate its stature. I certainly would like to see that happen. I've got two of my big cufflinks on my shirt, and usually one on top of my kippah, but I don't see Israel playing that role. I mean, that's a role that China would play, and if China saw another country play it, whether it's Israel, India, or anybody else, they'd want to step in and take over because it's that important. I can't think of another military conflict that has been this momentous since 1945. But Israel's moral decision is not as clear-cut. Is it more moral right now to join a very large chorus of Western countries condemning Putin and the Soviet Union? Or is it more moral when Iran would then have more and more weapons stockpiled in Syria to have the freedom of movement to go and knock those out because an angry Russia isn't going to retard your ability to defend yourself that way. So from a moral standpoint, as far as Israel's responsibility to itself, to its citizens, to its security, I don't know that the right answer right now is to condemn Vladimir Putin, even though he's extraordinarily worthy of condemnation, and everybody in Israel knows that. And I don't think that the United States is going to bear a grudge against Israel because ultimately, I think if they look closely at their own history, they were the ones who created the vacuum in the Middle East that enabled the Russians to move in and the Syrians and the Iranians to expand. So the Iranians have expanded, and they win both ways. Right now, their relationship with Russia is more even than it was. Iran was not happy that Russia was letting Israel knock all their stuff out. I mean, there's a cost associated. The cost of life doesn't seem to bother them as much, but they're sending all this new cool stuff to the Syrians, this new cool stuff to Hezbollah through Syria, and Israel knocks them out. It knocks out a few dozen of their personnel along the way. And Iran knows that Russia can stop this. And Russia says, well, we're not stopping it. Why? Well, because we're not happy with you in here. We're not that happy with you in Syria anyway. We'll tolerate you, but only to a point. Now, Russian tolerance is going to go up because Russia's going to look for friends in new alignments and new coalitions as the global order is shifting so dramatically at a speed that we haven't seen in 75 years. And so the Iranians benefit from having more of an eye-level, equal relationship with Russia, and they benefit tremendously from rising oil prices, and where they're going to benefit the most is in Vienna, because the sanctions against Russia are hitting Russia hard, but they're also hitting Europe, and ultimately the United States. You're going to be paying more money for your gas unless you drive a Tesla or another electric car. It's not a commercial, but I do have a couple of shares, and a Tesla. But I think the message is that the West is going to be even more desperate to do a deal with Iran, because one of the components of that deal is that Iranian oil is going to be brought back into the global supply chain, and that supply chain is going to mitigate the increased costs of oil that we've been seeing over the past month plus in anticipation of this conflict, and once the conflict actually started, and certainly with the sanctions. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned that the Iranians are being emboldened. And it's not just about the pace at which they're developing their nuclear program. You know, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut was interviewed recently, and he was saying that, you know, the Trump administration was at fault for pulling out of the JCPOA because since then the Iranians have accelerated their nuclear program. They're spinning more centrifuges. They're acquiring knowledge, and diplomacy won't get rid of their knowledge, and even a military strike won't get rid of their knowledge. He's right about that. They know more about nuclear development today than they did in 2018 when the Trump administration pulled out of the agreement. Jerusalem applauded the pullout. The Jewish community here applauded the pullout. I personally thought it was appropriate to pull out because I thought that coupled with sanctions, that would have a motivating impact, if not on the Iranian leadership, then maybe on the Iranian people. But the truth of the matter is that the breakout time in the JCPOA is at least a year. The breakout time without the JCPOA is weeks, maybe a few months. And now the folks at Vienna are trying to negotiate what the time frame should be. But the sunset clauses are still in there. And the Western world, which, as I mentioned in the very first talk, where the Ukraine-Russia thing wasn't that big a deal, it was 3 weeks ago, to the credit of the Biden administration, they haven't been in such a huge hurry to re-enter the agreement. It was a campaign priority to re-enter the agreement, but in over a year of the administration, while they prioritized many other things, they weren't giving in to Iranian demands. And now it seems, from what I'm hearing and reading, that they're more anxious to get back into that deal for political and frankly for economic reasons. Now, military strategists talk about your war options in terms of dime. You've got diplomacy, intelligence, military, and economic. And, all four of those seem to be in play here with the NATO-Ukraine conflict. Diplomacy, the door is still open, right? There's still an opportunity in Belarus. I mean, Putin and Zelensky haven't met each other directly. On this. Intelligence, there's a lot of work being done in Russia itself to dampen the misinformation that's coming from the Russian government. So we are enabling Russian people to get information that's different than what they're getting from the Kremlin. Military, we're sending stuff to Ukraine, but not really the stuff they need. They need serious anti-aircraft material. They need some way to reduce Russia's absolute control of the skies. And from an economic standpoint, we'll see. Obviously, these sanctions are hurting a lot. The oligarchs are, likely to lose their yachts. I don't know what kind of impact that's going to have on Vladimir Putin. I don't know if they're going to be able to find his boats. But the Jewish oligarchs are, people think that most of the oligarchs were Jews, not most, but a lot. And, Roman Abramovich says, I'm going to sell assets that I can fund humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. Several of these oligarchs also hold Israeli passports. The Times of Israel, I think, identified 18 Jewish oligarchs, and they were very close to Putin, but it's 18 out of 210. So, but this really isn't good for anybody. And certainly the Jewish communities, not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia itself, are very, very strongly supported by those dollars. And the association between the oligarchs and the communities is pretty tight. To the extent the oligarchs are marginalized, with all due credit to Zelensky and being a Jewish president and all that, this never winds up well for Jewish communities. So I think that it's going to be a fascinating few weeks and maybe even a fascinating few months. But fascinating, not in a great way. I mean, I'm watching Turkey and how they're responding to all of this. This is actually a good day for Erdogan. Erdogan and Putin have a troubled relationship. You know, they're at odds with each other in Syria, they're at odds with each other in Libya. Russia and Turkey have fought countless wars over the years, and now if Russia actually takes over Ukraine, then Turkey pretty much loses any real control that it had over the Black Sea. Turkey was the dominant power in the Black Sea, and they wouldn't be, which is one of the reasons why Russia wanted Crimea so badly and the Sevastopol port there. So I think that Turkey is now trying to make nice with the U.S. administration. Remember, Turkey wanted those F-22s, and they wanted F-35s. They were about to get them, and then when Erdogan became such a saber-rattler leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Trump administration pulled back on that. They also weren't willing to give up their deal with Russia for the SAM 400s, the anti-aircraft weapons. So I think the talk, from what I've heard, the talk right now is we'll give up our SAM 400s, our anti-aircraft. Please give us the fighter jets we need to bomb the Kurds, or whatever else they plan to do with their fighter jets, hopefully not bomb Israel. And on the Israel front, we're seeing a rapprochement as well. So President Herzog is going to be meeting with President Erdogan next month. He was cautious enough, by the way, he's a figurehead president, but he's not a political lightweight, and he was advised to visit with Greece and visit with Cyprus before visiting with Turkey, so he visited with Greece last week. He's going to be in Cyprus next week, and then he'll be in Turkey next month. His brother, by the way, replaced Ron Dermer. Michael Herzog is now Israel's Israeli ambassador to the United States. So it's going to be interesting to see what Michael comes from the defense establishment, and their father, by the way, was president of Israel in the 1980s. So this is certainly not a lightweight family, but again, Israel, the president is a figurehead, but it's good for the Israeli government to be able to have a president who is effective at least symbolically, showing that there is a potentially better relationship with Turkey. Neither country benefited from the rancor that existed over the past 12 years. I think, ironically, Turkey is more eager than Israel is to have a better relationship. But coming back to where we started regarding the Israeli government, I think that, to the surprise of many, such an unwieldy coalition. It's not just that you have 8 factions. Even within the factions, you have dissidents. As I mentioned, Yamina only got 7 seats in the Knesset, but the 7 became 6 because Amichai Shikli said, I'm not voting for this government. And Nir Orbach, who's another member of Yamina, wasn't going to either, but then there were demonstrations outside his house, so he finally capitulated, and he was going to resign the Knesset, but the person who would replace him would have been an even more pro-coalition person, so he decided maybe he could be like a Joe Manchin type, where he can be a kingmaker. But on the domestic front, Israel's doing very well, and on the global front, Israel seems to be doing very well. The Abraham Accords were part of this administration. Prime Minister Netanyahu was Prime Minister when these accords were signed, but there certainly was a hope that the relationships would be deepened, and they have been. Both Foreign Minister Lapid and Defense Minister Gantz visited Bahrain. Pretty much everyone's been to Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Morocco, Sudan. These are all relevant countries that have had now enjoyed fledgling bilateral relationships with Israel. The UAE and Israel are about to sign a free trade agreement, which is also mind-boggling, but very refreshing. I mentioned this in the past. Maybe this crisis is a way to get Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, although the price will become a lot higher than it would have been a couple of weeks ago, because this feels in many ways like the Cold War 2.0. And you had a lot of these marginal countries who were able to extract very, very large goodies, very large baskets of goodies from the Soviet Union, as it then was, in the United States, in order to get recruited, seduced into their respective spheres of influence. And it's too early to tell how all this is going to play out. Domestically, I think in Israel, there's a pretty broad base of support for this government. Netanyahu's trial keeps getting delayed, whether it's police spyware on folks' cell phones or other dilatory tactics. He doesn't seem to be leaving the leadership of the Likud anytime soon. But if he does, I think that's going to be the biggest task. More so than anything happening in Ukraine, more so than anything that a country is usually challenged with economically, politically, socially, culturally. The biggest threat to this coalition is Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the longer he stays, I think the longer this glue will last. As soon as he leaves, my own personal prediction is that this unravels pretty quickly. That seemed like a big deal and something very interesting to talk about 4 months ago. But right now, as I think you've heard in what I've prioritized in the lecture, world events have dominated pretty much everything else. And there's so many moving pieces. If you want to use the chess example, there's so many wild cards in the deck that anybody who wants to prognosticate is welcome to do so. My own feeling is that I really hope this ends sooner than later, and then it'll be fascinating to see how folks climb down from their trees. So, Shabbat Shalom, and I'll take questions.
Two questions, Professor. Number one, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear capability 30 years ago, the United States and other major countries guaranteed its security. The implication was with military force, not just sending sanctions or armaments. Any comments on that? Number two, do you think the oligarchs, 200 of them, really have any influence on Putin to stop the war in Ukraine?
So I'll repeat the questions. The first question was that 30 years ago, when Ukraine gave up its nukes, various countries, including the United States and others, guaranteed its security. You can look this up, and to the best of my knowledge, when Ukraine did give up its nukes, the country that guaranteed security was Russia. The United States and the West did not offer the same guarantee. And certainly the question you did ask is, do I think the Ukrainians are sorry? Yes. But there was not any overture of security or pact made with any other country except Russian assurances that Ukraine would be protected in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons. Regarding the oligarchs, the question was, do I think that the oligarchs, the 210 or whatever the number is, really do have influence over Putin? Yes and no. First of all, 210 is a very large number, and not all oligarchs are equal. There are probably about 24 that have disproportionate wealth, right? So I assume all of them are billionaires, either known or unknown in terms of where their assets are. 80% of the Russian economy is shunted overseas on an annual basis. But I think that money talks, and I think that if the oligarchs really felt collectively that their lifestyle was being permanently threatened, they would be able to go to London, they would be able to go to Miami, they would be able to go to New York, they would be able to go to Berlin. They would be able to send their kids to private schools in those countries. You could have a serious lobby on Putin. But at the end of the day, it's who has the tanks and who has the planes. So unless there was an ability to connect the money with the military, it's a bit of a stretch. Yes, Richard.
Well, I have a comment and two questions. My comment is about Netanyahu. Let's not forget that Netanyahu changed Israel from a socialist country to a free enterprise country. When he was the finance minister, and it changed the whole industry of Israel. And second of all, also about Netanyahu is the reason the coalition exists, it's a hate for Netanyahu. Period. Okay. Now my question is about Iran. I think Israel has to look out for their own interests as far as Ukraine. Because if Israel has to defend itself, they have to look at the world and see what they can do. Because not America, but other nations, we might be talking about it, will come to the place of Israel. Because Israel, my question to you, do you think Israel has the capability of striking Iran? That's the next question. I'm not going to ask you for question. Anyway, the next question is about, we know the relationship under Netanyahu with the conservative, the reform movement in America was very bad because of the Haredi reform government indicated to the Haredi streets. And that's really disassociate many American with Israel because it felt that outsiders were going to like the Jews to worship with the ones and everything else. And that lead to the certain parts of Israel, especially global congregation, has eliminated a lot of the people.
So I understand your questions, so I think Israel can strike Iran, and the question is, did Netanyahu alienate the conservative and reform Jews in the United States? Yeah, Israel can certainly strike Iran. Israel has been striking Iran, surreptitiously and with pricks and strikes here and there for 20 years, and that it can, and I believe it will continue to. I think you're right about even before this Russia-Ukraine conflict, I didn't think any other country would strike Iran on Israel's behalf. Maybe they would strike Iran on their own behalf, but even now it seems like the UAE and Saudi are not objecting to what's going on in Vienna in the way that they were objecting in 2015. So counterintuitively, even with the Abraham Accords, there isn't consensus among the parties to the Abraham Accords regarding the feasibility of re-engaging Iran in a comprehensive plan of action. Israel cannot knock out Iranian nuclear installations anymore, or all Iranian nuclear installations, any more than a coordinated effort between, Israel and the United States. I mean, the United States and Israel also, that use tactical nuclear weapons, can bomb Iran back into the Stone Age. I don't think it'll do that. I mean, that would happen in an existential conflict, which none of us want to think about. But before we get there, I think Israel is going to try to do as much as it possibly can to curtail, both diplomatically and militarily, but not overtly, covertly. Covert military operations against Iran will continue, many of which we don't know about. It's not in Israel's interest for the world to know what it does against Iran. It's in Israel's interest that Iran knows what Israel does against Iran, and obviously the Iranians do, because it's happening to them. Sometimes it takes years for them to discover that stuff is not in flame, or they corrupted the software in the centrifuges. But I don't know what Israel will decide to do. I don't know what Israel will decide to do once this agreement is signed, as it looks like it will be, or what this agreement will say. The argument is that there's going to be transparency into the Iranian nuclear program than there wasn't before. It seems like a longer and stronger agreement is now off the table because the Iranians were never up for that, which is one of the reasons why it's taken this long. The administration had its way, they would have re-entered the agreement on week 2 of the administration. But it's now year 2 of the administration, and they haven't consummated that deal yet. After the deal is done, I think the Israelis will take a bit of a wait-and-see approach. But obviously, the folks in Israel are having a very similar discussion, and having it with a much deeper perspective of what their capabilities are and what the threats are. So you and I probably get our information from similar sources and probably want the same thing. Israeli military and political leadership have better sources, and they have a deeper understanding of what their own defense and offense, tactical, strategic, cyber are. So if the question you sort of asked is, do I have confidence in the Israeli political intelligence and military establishments to do the best they can under these circumstances? Yeah, my level of confidence is quite high. Regarding the alienation of the conservative reform movements in the United States, yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with the coalition at the time and the role that the religious parties played in that. I think some of it had to do with domestic politics here as well. I think that Bibi was very, very closely identified with the right wing of the Republican Party, and once Trump became president, very, very closely aligned to President Trump. And the feeling among most Jews, particularly in the form of conservative movements, who tend to be a little bit more progressive or liberal in their political orientation, who, along with non-Jews who have that political orientation, detested President Trump. You know, the Quran says the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So here a lot of it was like the friend of my enemy is my enemy. So I think that had a role to play as well. Yes?
Yes, more basic question. You said that Israel has 8 political parties now. What's the criteria of forming a political party? I mean, 8 parties. I mean, surely there's got to be a way to diminish them into maybe 2 or 3 for a final vote. But why? How do they come to have 8? I mean, they might have 12. I mean, what's the population?
So the population of Israel is about 9 million people. I misspoke. There are not 8 parties in Israel. There are probably more like 28 parties in Israel. There are 8 parties that are a member of this coalition. There are about 14 parties in the Knesset. So, and there are about 10 other parties that didn't even get elected to the Knesset. And if I'm wrong, there might have been 15 other parties that didn't get elected to the Knesset, even though they ran it. So to answer your question, it doesn't take very much to form a political party. I'm a little bit busy after this class, but maybe next week catch up with me. We'll start our own party. You pick the name, I know it'll pick the colors. But the answer to your question is that there are 120 seats in the Israeli parliament. So all other things being equal, you could actually be a member of the Knesset with 5/6 of 1%. So if you got 5/6 of 1%, you know, obviously there are 9 million people in Israel, not everybody's eligible to vote, because not because Arabs and Jews are religious secular, just if you're under 18, you can't vote. So about 6.5 million people are eligible to vote. Voter participation in Israel is quite high, it's higher than here. So you usually have between about 4 and 5 million people voting in Israeli elections. So 1% of that is 50,000 people. So if you get 50,000 votes under normal circumstances, you think you'd be able to be a
But
good.
how do they form the party?
Okay. Well, you put together a list. You go to the electoral commission and say, here we are a party. I want to run on a list. So you go and you get yourself approved, and the assumption is that you will be approved unless, and there's certain criteria, that if you are advocating treason against the Jewish state, if you're advocating terrorism against the Jewish state or members of the community. Kahane was not allowed to run for the Knesset at some point. He did sit in the Knesset for 1 term as a single member. You can't do that anymore. So forming a party is very easy. And it's very easy in most places. It's harder to get elected. And in Israel, it's even harder to get elected. So in Israel, you need to cross a threshold of 3.5%. So you cannot be a party in the Knesset with 1 or 2 or even 3 members. If you don't have at least 4 members in the Knesset, you didn't make it. And your votes essentially were wasted, and they get distributed. So the answer to your question is, when you took that 3.5 to 13.5, you very quickly wind up with only 4 or 5 factions, maybe only 2 or 3. But it's a great question as a lead into next class, because next class we're going to talk about what's happening right here in America, what's going to happen in the midterms, and what's happening to the 2 parties, and there are only 2 parties, and in all likelihood there will only remain 2 parties for the foreseeable future. And the reason for that we'll discuss next week. But what's happening within each of those parties, the struggle for the soul of the parties, and the identity, they've stayed the same since pretty much the end of the Civil War, right? Once the Whigs disappeared, there really have only been Republicans and Democrats. There have been all sorts of different fringe parties that have come up, and some some even got electoral college votes. But there's never really been a series, again, the Dixiecrats in the 50s and 60s, but there's never really been a threat to the hegemony of the two-party system here in the United States. And we'll study the history of that and why, again, I think that's going to continue even if there is some sort of electoral reform. And I believe there's a bipartisan push for that. But in Israel, it's very easy to start a party. Here, it's very easy to start a party. It's just very hard to get elected. And in Israel, they made it a little bit more difficult to get elected. The push for that was Avigdor Lieberman when he was unequivocally identified with the right wing of the Israeli political spectrum, because a lot of these small Arab parties were getting in. But that had the effect of motivating them to consolidate, and they are at least as conflicted internally as the Jews are. But the fear of being completely marginalized politically motivated them to joining these combined lists. And at one point, they had as many as 15 members in the Knesset. One more question. Yes.
Two questions. What was the reasoning in Israel? Appointing an Arab woman from one of the left-wing parties as consul general in Shanghai, Minneapolis. The second question is part of it. Who is that Israeli right-wing politician that in Britain threw out the British
Tzal Smotrich. Yeah, Tzal Smotrich was one who was told by the British community, you're not welcome here. So Tzal Smotrich is a sort of, the progeny, the political progeny of Meir Kahane. He's got a very exclusionary view of the world. As far as he's concerned, it'd be better for Israel if the Arabs were, the word expulsion seems harsh. We're motivated economically and gently in air-conditioned buses to go someplace else. Certainly this idea of a two-state solution is anathema. He feels that Israel was already carved up in 1922 when the British gave Transjordan to the Hashemites. So any further diminution of Greater Israel is a travesty from his perspective. And he's not a bad guy. He's actually extraordinarily and charmingly consistent in his political views. He did want to join this government because he felt that it would be inconsistent to sit with non-Zionists. And the woman who was appointed the consul general, Zoabi, to Shanghai is not a clear Zionist, but she's not, she will stand for the national anthem, but she won't sing it. And people thought that was also anathema. I mean, how do you have a member of the Israeli government serve in such an important position and not be Zionistic enough to sing the Tikva? That doesn't bother me. Would I rather have somebody who is true blue and white serve in every one of our positions? She's not the ambassador to Beijing, so that's an important distinction. She's a consul general in a major city with strong business, economic, trade relationships with Israel. And she's, I think, going to do a fine job. I was not as concerned. I think that the test, if we're really going to be an integrated society, I think that Israel can pass, I don't know if it will, but certainly can pass the test, asking itself, can we be Zionistic, recognize that Israel is a Jewish homeland, but also have people who are full-fledged Israeli citizens who won't be forced to say that we're coming back to our homeland after 2,000 years of exile, recognizing that while the theme applies to many, it doesn't apply to every. And I think we should be able to pass that test. But I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.